Welcome to this week's episode of Pin Drop Perspectives, where we are diving into an original concept for a live-action TV series called Behavioral Sync. Let's not waste any time and turn things over to Mark and Jen for their analysis.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff, excerpts from a screenplay, actually, called Behavioral Sync. And I don't know about you, but I'm already getting some major dystopian vibes from this one.
You know, it's fascinating, the title itself, Behavioral Sync. It's like a reference to this whole scientific theory about overpopulation. Could give us some hints about where this story is going.
Oh, that's right, the Behavioral Sync. I've heard of that. Isn't that the one where, what was his name, John Calhoun did those rat experiments?
Yeah, John Calhoun. Those experiments are pretty disturbing, to say the least. Basically, he put all these rats in like super overcrowded spaces. They had food, water, everything they needed. But their behavior, oh man, it took a dark turn. Aggression, social withdrawal, even cannibalism.
So too many rats in one place, even with plenty of food and stuff, and they just like lose it, basically.
Basically, yeah. The theory is that all that crowding leads to total societal breakdown. And that's where the screenplay gets really interesting. It takes that theory, right?
Yeah.
Applies it to humans. But in this very specific scenario. Okay, so picture this. It's 2025. Overpopulation in the U.S. is out of control. And the government, they cook up this lottery system. It's called the Population Recovery Act, or the PRA.
Okay, so I see where the behavioral sync thing comes in, but like a lottery to decide who, you know, that's pretty dark, even for a dystopia.
It is. The PRA basically says if your number gets pulled, you got to sacrifice yourself for the greater good, they call it. And that's where we meet our main character, David Foster. Normal guy, just living his life. Then bam, his name gets drawn. Talk about bad luck.
Oof, I can only imagine that feeling in the pit of your stomach.
Yeah.
It's not just about David, though, right? The screenplay, it shows us what life is like for everyone else living in this world, too, right? What's that like?
It's a tightly controlled world, that's for sure. Curfews everywhere, you know, military on the streets constantly. And only businesses the government deems essential can stay open. And to actually enforce the PRA, they have the Population Recovery Team. Or the PRT.
The PRT. So they're the ones going around and, well, you know, enforcing this whole thing. It's got to create some tension, right? How are people dealing with it all?
Well, David's friends, they're a good example of the different reactions you get. You've got Ashley and Dee. They're horrified, obviously.
Yeah.
You see it as straight up murder. Then there's Viv. She's all for the PRA. Thinks it's a necessary sacrifice for the good of humanity.
Even in this crazy situation, people have totally different ways of seeing it.
It's human nature, right? Always different perspectives. And then there's Caleb. He's kind of in the middle, sees the tragedy, but also understands maybe why they're doing it.
That's a tough spot to be in, trying to see both sides when the stakes are that high.
You got that right.
Yeah.
And, you know, this dystopian society they're in, it's pretty extreme. The government basically controls everything. People's rights are, well, pretty much non-existent.
Yeah.
And those sanctuary cities everyone's whispering about, those are supposed to be places where the PRE doesn't apply, like little rebellions topping up.
So while all this is going on, we have David just sitting there waiting for the PRT to show up. Talk about stressful.
Oh, yeah. And to make things even more complicated, his friend Carl, he's like a hardcore supporter of the PRA. He actually ends up shooting himself when his own name comes up.
Wow, that's intense. What do you think that says about, well, everything?
It's definitely a turning point in the screenplay. Shows how deeply the PRA is messing with people's minds, even those who believe in it, you know. Makes you question the whole psychological toll the system is taking on everyone.
It's like his own beliefs, they turned against him in the worst way possible.
Exactly. And it's not just happening in David's little circle either. You see glimpses of the bigger picture, too. News reports about riots breaking out, violence getting worse. It's like the whole country's going haywire.
Sounds like things are falling apart. So what about David? Does he just give up?
No way. He's not going down without a fight. He decides to run for it. With his girlfriend, Kim, and their friends Dee, Ashley, and Caleb, they're heading for Boston. That's one of those rumored sanctuary cities, right? So it's this desperate attempt to escape a system that's basically rigged against them.
I bet that escape is anything but easy. I mean, they're going up against the government, right?
Yeah, and that's when we meet Sam Traylor. She's a PRT advisor, meaning she's one of the people responsible for actually implementing the PRA.
Yeah.
But she's clearly struggling with, the ethics of it all. Adds a whole other layer to this story.
It's like she's starting to see the real people behind the policy, the people getting hurt. What is it that makes her start questioning everything?
Well, there's this really powerful scene. She meets a little boy named Julio. He gives her this drawing. And it's like this small thing, but it really shakes her. Reminds her that the PRA isn't just about numbers. It's about real lives being affected.
That must be a tough position to be in. Following orders, but also seeing the damage those orders are causing.
It is. And then, get this, the screenplay throws in another twist. That lottery, it's not random at all. The government, they're picking specific people. Anyone who speaks out against the PRA, like this Senator Baxter guy, his name gets pulled right after he criticizes the program on TV.
So it's not even really about population control. It's about silencing anyone who disagrees. Wow. That's messed up.
It is. And then, just to drive the point home, another PRT advisor, Jenkins, he gets killed.
Yeah.
By a civilian who's just had enough of the whole thing.
Oh,
It's a real turning point for Sam. It makes her doubt everything even more.
Witnessing something like that, it would definitely shake you up. So is the government, are they backing down at all with all this resistance and stuff?
Nope, not even a little bit. In fact, the screenplay makes it seem like they're doubling down. More pressure, more enforcement. Doesn't matter how much people are pushing back.
Yikes. That's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Yeah.
So what happens to David and his friends? Are they safe yet?
Well, the PRT, they go back to David's apartment, but he's already gone, obviously. All they find is Viv and Carl's body.
Ooh, that's not going to be good for Viv. She's already kind of lost it.
Right. And the screenplay really leans into that. Viv starts blaming David for everything, setting the stage for even more conflict.
Oh, man, that's not good. But at least they're not alone, right? They have their friends with them.
True. But here's the catch. They think they've gotten away. They're driving towards Boston, feeling all hopeful and everything. But little do they know, they're being tracked. Through Ashley's phone, someone hit a tracker in her phone.
Oh, no. That's a terrible place to end it. What happens next?
Well, for that, you'll have to tune into part 2. It's crazy how the screenplay, it jumps back and forth, between the character stories and then this whole societal collapse thing happening all around them.
I know, right? You see these people dealing with fear and desperation, having to make these tough choices just to survive. And you can't help but wonder, what would I do if I were in their shoes?
Yeah, tough question. Would you do whatever it takes to stay alive? Even if it meant, like, betraying your friends, going against your beliefs, it really makes you think.
It does. And the screenplay, it doesn't shy away from showing how power can corrupt.
Yeah.
Especially in a crisis like this, the rigged lottery, the way the media is controlled. It's like a textbook example of what happens when the government gets too much power.
Totally. It's this scary reminder of how fear and propaganda, they can be used to manipulate people. Get them to accept things they'd never agree to normally, all in the name of the greater good, of course.
Yeah, and it's kind of like we see echoes of that in the real world sometimes, which is a little unsettling.
You're not wrong there. But even with all the doom and gloom, the screenplay, it still has these glimmers of hope, don't you think?
I do.
Well,
like David and his determination to escape, and then those teenage boys, the ones filming the PRT's brutality, even Sam and her internal struggle. It all shows that even when everything's falling apart, the human spirit, it finds ways to resist.
Yeah, there's a resilience there.
Yeah.
A refusal to just lie down and take it.
Ooh. Something I thought was interesting, how the screenplay uses the setting, to kind of reflect the whole overpopulation and decay thing, the dark streets, all the abandoned places, soldiers everywhere. It creates this feeling of being trapped and claustrophobic.
Yeah. Like the physical environment is a mirror of what's happening inside people's heads. This feeling of being trapped in a world that's both overcrowded and lonely.
It's like the walls are closing in, right? Literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's that big question the screenplay keeps asking. Is it ever okay to sacrifice some people for the so-called greater good?
Right. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Who decides whose life is more important? Philosophers have been debating that for centuries, haven't they? And the screenplay, it brings that debate to life in such a raw, emotional way.
Totally. It makes you confront those huge questions.
Yeah.
Without giving you any easy answers.
I couldn't help but think about how some of the reactions to the PRA, they're kind of like what we see happening today. All the debates about vaccines, lockdown, stuff like that.
Yeah, you're right. The screenplay really taps into that tension between individual freedom and the needs of society. How easily fear and division can be used to control people, especially during a crisis.
It's a good reminder that these aren't just theoretical debates, you know? They have real-world impacts on real people's lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of real-world stuff, it's worth thinking about how this screenplay connects to some of the things we're worried about today, like climate change, limited resources, inequality.
Yeah, good point. The screenplay might be fiction, but it's definitely a cautionary tale. Makes you think about what could happen if we don't address these problems.
It's a warning, right, about the dangers of unchecked population growth, the breakdown of democratic values. It's like it's holding a mirror up to society, saying, hey, this is what could happen if you're not careful.
Something else I noticed. The role of technology in all of this. It's being used to both enforce the PRA and control people's behavior. The tracking, the surveillance, it's kind of creepy.
Yeah, good point. It makes you think about the ethics of technology, right? How much control should we give it? How do we protect privacy and freedom in a world that's so connected?
Those are some important questions we all need to be asking.
I agree. The screenplay doesn't shy away from showing violence either. But it's not, like, gratuitous, you know. It's there to show how desperate things have gotten, how brutal the situation really is.
It's not glorifying violence. It's using it to show what's at stake, the consequences of the choices people are making.
It's about showing the human cost, you know, how this whole system breaks people down, pushes them to their limits.
But I think it's the psychological aspect that really gets to you, right? The trauma, the paranoia, how it just eats away at people's hope.
Absolutely. That scene with Sam, where she totally breaks down after seeing what happened at Jessica's apartment, after the PRT came through, that one really stays with you.
It's like even those enforcing this awful program, they're not immune to the emotional impact. They're still human beings wrestling with their conscience.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that there are always real people on the receiving end of these policies.
And then there's the leadership, or rather the lack of it. President Thorne is such a scary character. The way he uses the PRA for his own political gain, his total disregard for human life, it's awful.
He's the classic example of how power corrupts, even with good intentions, you know.
And it really highlights how important it is to hold our leaders accountable, to make sure they're actually serving the people they're supposed to represent.
Right. We can't just blindly trust those in charge. We have a responsibility to question, to challenge, to hold them to a higher standard.
So we've talked about the characters, the setting, the themes, but what about the bigger picture? What's the overall message of this screenplay?
It's a cautionary tale, for sure, but it's also a call to action. It's saying, look, this is what could happen if we're not careful, but it doesn't have to end this way. We have the power to make different choices, to build a better future.
It's about realizing that the choices we make individually and as a society, they matter. They have consequences. We can ignore the warning signs, or we can face them head on and try to make things better.
Exactly. And knowledge, that's a powerful tool, right? The more we understand these issues, the better equipped we are to make good decisions and create real change.
And that's what I love about these deep dives, you know. They make us think critically about the world and engage with these big questions.
I couldn't agree more. It's about empowering ourselves with knowledge and using it to make a difference.
Okay, so we left off on a cliffhanger, right? With David and his friends being tracked, what happens next?
Well, let's dive into part 3 and find out.
People are dying in rural Pennsylvania, and something very dark is stalking through a small town. Only investigator Derek Whitcomb can solve the case. What is hiding in Willow Grove? Pick up your copy of The Kelleher by Thomas Muller on Amazon today.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into behavioral sync. I'm still kind of freaked out about that cliffhanger, you know. They're driving along thinking they're free, and bam! Someone's tracking them. Talk about stressful.
Yeah, the tension is definitely ratcheted up. Knowing the PRT is on their trail, it just adds this whole other layer of danger to their journey, doesn't it? And they're trying to reach this sanctuary city, which who even knows if it really exists? It's like a ticking time bomb.
Speaking of ticking time bombs, I'm curious to see how the whole behavioral sync idea plays out in this last part. We've already seen some hints of it, right? With the riots and the violence and even Carl's suicide. But does it get, like, even worse?
Oh, it definitely escalates. Remember those disturbing things Calhoun observed in his rat experiments? Well, the screenplay starts mirroring them as things really start to unravel.
Whoa, I didn't even think about that. So which characters, like, start going full behavioral sync?
Well, we've already seen Viv kind of lose it, right? With the paranoia and blaming David for everything. That's a pretty clear example of the social distortion Calhoun talked about. But the screenplay takes it a step further. We start to see other characters making these really desperate choices, almost like they're losing their humanity.
You know, it's like the longer they're exposed to this pressure cooker environment, the more their basic instincts take over.
Exactly. It becomes less about physical survival and more about this like primal need to just survive no matter what. And the screenplay doesn't hold back from showing us the dark places that can lead to.
Makes you wonder, right? Like, is the screenwriter saying that under these conditions, anyone could become susceptible to this behavioral sink phenomenon?
That's a good question. And honestly, I don't think the screenplay gives us a clear-cut answer. But it definitely raises those uncomfortable questions about, the limits of human resilience, how even the most civilized society can crumble when things get bad enough.
It's like a warning, right? A big what-if scenario that forces us to confront our own potential for darkness.
Right. And it's not just about individual behavior either. The screenplay also points a finger at the systems that create these conditions in the first place.
Oh, totally. Like we were talking about before. The government overreach, the manipulation of the media, the way they use fear and division to control people. All of that contributes to this behavioral sink effect, right?
Absolutely. The screenplay is saying that it's not just about human nature, but also about the choices that those in power make, the systems they build.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we can't just sit back and accept things the way they are. We got to challenge injustice, hold our leaders accountable, fight for a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And the screenplay, for all its bleakness, does offer a glimmer of hope, don't you think? It's like a call to action, telling us we have the power to change things, to make things better.
Totally. That brings us back to the listener, right? What can they take away from all of this? What can they do with this knowledge?
Well, one of the big things for me is the importance of critical thinking. Don't just accept things at face value. The screenplay encourages us to question everything, to dig deeper, to challenge the status quo.
It's about being informed, being engaged, and speaking up for what you believe in.
Exactly. And it's also about understanding how everything is interconnected. The things we see in the screenplay, overpopulation, climate change, social inequality, the erosion of democratic values, these things are all linked. You can't address one without addressing the others.
It's like a domino effect, right? If one system starts to crumble, the others are probably going to follow. So we got to be working on solutions at every level, both individually and as a society.
And honestly, that's where I find the hope in all of this. The screenplay might be dark, but it's ultimately saying, hey, things might be messed up right now, but we have the power to change them. It's not too late.
That's a really powerful message to end on. We might not be facing a dystopian lottery system like in behavioral sink, but we definitely have our own challenges to deal with.
We do. But this deep dive, it's given us a way to understand those challenges better and to start thinking about solutions.
Well said. Any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
Just this. Never stop learning, never stop questioning, and never give up on making the world a better place. Let behavioral sink be a wake-up call, not a source of despair. Use it to fuel your passion for change.
I love that. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, and there's always something we can do. Well, folks, that's a wrap on our deep dive into behavioral sink. It's been a wild ride full of twists and turns, but we hope you found it as thought-provoking as we have.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope you'll continue to explore these themes, ask those tough questions, and never stop learning. Until next time, stay curious out there.
If you enjoyed this week's episode on behavioral sink, you can request a copy of the pilot episode by reaching out to Pin Drop Entertainment. Next week, Mark and Jen are diving into a horror comedy screenplay that incorporates vampies, water coolers, and the Vatican. And remember, keep your perspective open. Artificial intelligence was used to assist in generating audio content for this episode.